Hello, everyone. My name is Pat Sturdivant, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to Re-envisioning Public Safety and Policing in Sacramento. I serve on the board of directors of the National Council of Jewish Women, and I am chair of the Section Policy Advocacy Committee. Our intent today is to inform you about how our mayor, city council, and state government are addressing the public's demands for racial justice and an end to police brutality. Our speakers will be describing recently enacted and proposed legislation, as well as a number of efforts underway to enhance public safety and reform policing practices in Sacramento. These include limiting when the police can use lethal force, creating a new inspector general position with the power to review police shootings and recommend discipline, and enabling the Sacramento Community Police Review Commission to have a greater role in oversight of the police. Another proposal under consideration is to transfer city funds to allow 911 calls that involve mental health or homeless issues, not crimes, to be handled in alternative and more holistic ways. We are fortunate to have three extremely knowledgeable speakers for today's program. We have already received many questions for the speakers, but if you have new questions, please post them in the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer them. Our first speaker is Assemblymember Kevin McCarty. Since 2014, Mr. McCarty has represented the 7th Assembly District, which includes Sacramento, West Sacramento, and parts of unincorporated Sacramento County. As the chair of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Education Finance, he helps oversee the largest component of California's multi-billion-dollar budget. His other legislative proposals include housing affordability, climate change, criminal justice reform, curbing gun violence, the opioid crisis, and advocating for the middle class. A lifelong Sacramentan, McCarty began his public service career as a housing and redevelopment commissioner, then served on the Sacramento City Council from 2004 to 2014. After going to American River College, he earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Cal State University, Long Beach, and a master's degree in public policy and administration from Cal State University, Sacramento. Mr. McCarty, would you please begin the discussion by describing the important law you co-sponsored last session that changed the standard for when police can use lethal force, as well as the bills on policing reforms, which are now being considered in the current legislative session?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for having me here this afternoon on this Sunday afternoon. We can't be outside, so we might as well be talking about important issues that impact our community. And this is clearly something that's gotten the attention, not of just our local community here in Sacramento, but across the state and across the nation. And so we're going to get to that. And post George Floyd, the renewed focus to bring about meaningful police reform. But I've been at this issue since my first month in the legislature when I introduced a bill focusing on independent investigations for deadly force, which I'll get to in a bit. But in the last few years, we've had a number of high-profile shootings across the country that have really raised the question as far as when is deadly force necessary, when is it appropriate. People now see it with their own two eyes. They saw with George Floyd, they saw, the murder, an unjust murder with their own two eyes. And so, we saw it here in Sacramento a couple of years ago with Stephon Clark. And before that with Mr. McIntyre in North Sacramento, and a number of these police shootings and killings where we just, as a whole thought, there has to be a better way. So 2 years ago, Dr. Shirley Weber and I introduced a bill after the Stephon Clark shooting, which really took a look at this issue of deadly force as far as when it should be necessary. It took us a couple years to get us across the finish line, but that bill was finally signed by Governor Newsom last year. About a year ago today, the bill was signed actually. And that was Assembly Bill 392, which changes the paradigm as far as deadly force permissiveness in California with police officers. So For 100 years, the standard for when law enforcement could use their firearm or any other deadly force was it was called the reasonable standard. You know, when reasonable in through the eyes of another law enforcement individual. And we thought that was very arbitrary. Obviously, what is reasonable in the officer's eyes is maybe not reasonable, and what the public can see with their own two eyes. So, you know, we worked on a bill and we changed a law last year to create, you know, the strongest use of force standard in the nation, which changes it from reasonable to only when necessary. So, you know, think about with the Stephon Clark situation. Could they have sent in the K-9 unit? Could they have formed a perimeter and had the helicopter like they had above? There were alternative means to focusing on that situation other than deadly force. And so now police departments up and down the state, including Sacramento, which I understand there's a debate whether or not they're fully implementing it, which I know we're going to get to later on. The standard is only when necessary can law enforcement use deadly force. So that was the big bill 392. But we realized that we're not done as well. There's a number of issues that we're focusing on. I think there are several big ones this year that we have 1 week left in the legislature to finalize. And a couple of the big bills left are actually my bills. There's one bill that I have overseeing sheriff's departments. You know, we have oversight of their police department, like we're going to talk about in a bit. But many times sheriff's departments don't have that same accountability. And they're the ones who, frankly, have to pay out these huge lawsuits every year for excessive force in the county jails, for deadly force and wrongful death lawsuits. So over and over, we see that sheriff's departments do not have proper oversight and accountability. And even when they do, they ignore it. We had a sheriff here who didn't like the individual overseeing the sheriff's department. And it wasn't like it was an ACLU lawyer or something like that, which, by the way, I love ACLU lawyers. But our person doing the oversight was our former police chief of the city of Sacramento, Rick Brazil. And he was locked out of the sheriff's department. Literally, the sheriff changed the lock on the door. And so my bill would say you can't do that anymore. It would give subpoena power to these entities like these oversight bodies. So that's my big bill, 1185. And my other big bill is AB 1506, and that would focus on the investigations after the fact. Of course, we want to prevent deadly force in the first place, which is what AB 392 was about. But in the event that an officer does cross the line, use deadly force, use unnecessary force, essentially the current model, we have the police policing themselves, including the local DA who does the investigation. And there's a huge conflict of interest there. You know, maybe not a legal and ethical conflict from a lawyer perspective, but an absolute perception conflict. Because let's face it, DAs, you know, when they get elected, they have to work with the police union, the sheriff to get elected. They're counting on them to testify in their cases. So there's too much of a cozy relationship there. And so there are 5 states across the nation that have done this, led by Republican governors and Democrat governors. So it's not really a complicated proposal I'm putting out there. Frankly, I think it's common sense. It says that, you know, some of these deadly force, high profile deadly force incidents, we should have an independent investigation, not the local DA doing the lead. And so that's my second big bill, which will be up for a vote this week. And so these two, along with other bills, we have a bill on decertifying police officers when they cross the line. Right now, sometimes police officers can leave one police department and go to another police department, and that certainly doesn't promote public safety nor accountability. There's also, we have bills on the choking issue, the chokehold, getting rid of that in California, as well as another bill on police records. So a few other cleanup and important issues that we're working on. This issue is not going away. And so we're going to see an increased interest in making sure we have state laws which focus on this. But we need to be implement the local level. So I'm glad we have our local officials here today as well. So that's an intro on my piece, and look forward to the rest of the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCarty. Next, I would like to introduce Mario Guerrero, the chair of the Sacramento Community Police Review Commission. The commission was established to provide community participation in reviewing and recommending police department policies, practices, and procedures. It is further charged with monitoring the implementation, evaluation, and sustainability of city policing initiatives and programs. Mr. Guerrero is also Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs at the California Department of Human Resources. Welcome, Mr. Guerrero.
Thank you, Pat. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak with you and our fellow panelists and the attendees. As Pat mentioned, my name is Mario Guerrero, and I'm the chair of the Sacramento Community Police Review Commission. And so I wanted to make sure to start with that and ensure that folks have an idea of what the commission does. So the commission is an advisory body to the mayor and council here in the city of Sacramento. We look at programs and policies, and we make recommendations on those programs and policies. I believe the commission was created in 2017, and it is an 11-member body. 3 commissioners are appointed by the mayor, and the others are appointed by council members. In 2017, the commission came together and really didn't have any recommendations. I believe that there was some friction on the commission, and I believe that the chair at the time, at least one of the chairs, resigned. I came on board in 2018 and as a commissioner appointed by Councilmember Steve Hansen. And there we had a couple of work groups that we created at the beginning of the year. We did work throughout the year and came up with recommendations at the end. The 2 work groups were use of force work group and a diversity work group. I can tell you that the way the commission works is we create these work groups at the beginning of the year. We do research, we talk with community members, with organizations that do work in this space. We create broad draft recommendations that we bring back to the public for additional feedback. We go into the community presenting these draft recommendations, and then we tweak them based on that. We also, by the way, speak with SAC PD. We had a couple meetings with Chief Hahn as an example, and definitely with a number of police liaisons where we go over the recommendations. We also take into consideration their input, and we make any changes that we feel are important. And then again, we kind of finalize those recommendations. In 2018, at the end of 2018, we came up with a number of recommendations that I'll share a couple just to highlight. There are many. One of them was under use of force. One of the recommendations there really goes beyond even AB 392. AB 392 is an amazing, great law. I thank Assemblymember McCarty for championing that, and of course, Assemblymember Dr. Weber for authoring the bill. It does change the standard for use of force from reasonable to necessary. Here in Sacramento, the commission as a whole unanimously voted to go beyond that. Our recommendation still is that use of force should be the last resort. And so even when there is a threat to, some kind of real threat, for example, a person wielding a knife, that there are instances where you can still do things to de-escalate that situation instead of using lethal force right away. So that is one of the recommendations that we believe is extremely important. On the diversity front, we provided quite a few recommendations. One of them I actually brought over from my time at the California Faculty Association. We thought that ensuring that everyone that went to a CSU had ethnic studies course, so that we understand structural racism, the history of racist laws in our country, that would really help anyone that's doing the job of a police officer. And so one of the recommendations there was to require all cadets to have an ethnic studies course. So that was 2018. In 2019, we set up a couple of different work groups, including a body-worn camera work group, another use of force work group, and a mental health work group. The body-worn cameras, one of the recommendations was that police officers should not have the option to turn off or on, their cameras off or on, that they should just automatically turn them on. And by the way, they should turn them on as they respond to a call, not after they get out of the vehicle and and see something going wrong. Use of force, we went further, knowing that AB 392 at the time was adopted, and AB 392, again, an amazing bill, but it left out a number of definitions, and there are reasons for that. So we added a number of really important definitions and additional context. For example, de-escalation, we added a lot more examples to that definition of that. And then on mental health, we didn't really finalize that because the chair of that work group left midway, so we weren't able to finish that work. In 2020, we have 2 work groups, one on accountability and discipline, that's one, and then the second on mental health to continue the work from the previous year. The accountability discipline work group is a work group that was long called for. Since I joined in 2018, we had community come in and say we could have the best policies in place, but unless we're able to hold police accountable when they do something terribly wrong, then there's not going to be much faith in the system. And so that is what the work group is looking at. We also have an internal work group that I didn't mention that has taken on the responsibility of looking at the commission itself, evaluating the commission to see what changes we should recommend to the mayor and council on how we can be a better vehicle to represent what the community wants and to really bring about justice. Finally, I just wanted to mention a couple of items that I know Pat mentioned, an inspector general and redirection of funding. Those are 2 items that the mayor here in the city of Sacramento has proposed. And as I said during his press conference for that, when the mayor talked about those 2 items, the details are extremely important. On the inspector general proposal, there would be an independent investigation created by this inspector general. The inspector general would be under the OPSA here in the city. We believe that as we look at that, one question is that truly independent? That is a question for the public, and that's a question for the commission to look at. The redirection of funding as we take away responsibilities from the police officers, responding to mental health calls, responding to homelessness issues, and maybe many others, for example, substance abuse. How do we reduce funding from police to redirect that to this department, and also maybe nonprofit organizations, community groups that are doing this work. So we are absolutely involved in this, and I would finally be remiss that we are working on a number of structural issues that really impact policy at the city. In regard to the SACPD, for example, SACPD can adopt a policy without the commission knowing. And so we believe that the commission should be aware of these things, and that before SACPD really adopts any new policy, at very minimum, since the commission provides the mayor and council recommendations on policies and programs, we should be made aware of, have the time to review that, and then SACPD can move forward with trying to change their policy with our input. So that's a lot of different policy issues, a lot of area for growth. I'll leave with this. Many of the commissioners and I have said time and time again that we really want Sacramento City to lead. We can certainly look at a law like AB 392 and implement that, and certainly fight to make sure that it's implemented fully. But we believe that Sacramento can do better. We believe that we can do more. And so that's why we put forward the recommendations that we have. And I think that is why we, at the end of this year, we will have very strong progressive recommendations for reforms. So I'll stop there. Thank you for giving me the time to speak today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Guerrero. Councilmember Alan Warren has represented Council District 2 since December 2012. He is also the founder, former president, and current chief executive officer of New Phase Development, a real estate development company. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science with a minor in business administration from Cal State Hayward, and was the first in his family to earn a college degree. He returned to Sacramento to start a business that would grow and enrich his old neighborhood. Utilizing a 5-acre parcel his mother owned, he developed a 26-lot subdivision in Del Paso Heights, launching his career as a builder and owner of New Phase Development. He also worked with a local nonprofit to build affordable single-family homes in North and South Sacramento, helping dozens of low-income and migrant families achieve the dream of homeownership. Mr. Warren has received recognition for his community service and philanthropic efforts, including the Robert Matsui Community Service Award and the American Leadership Community Service Award. He, in 2006, was named by Sacramento Magazine as one of the 50 most powerful people in Sacramento. Mr. Warren.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'd like to just say it's an honor and a privilege to be here this evening. And I come to you from Utah currently. I am here until tomorrow, and so that might be part of the reason for my technical difficulties. However, this issue that we're discussing today is very timely, and in fact, it is the challenge of the moment. I think our city, our state, and our country is under an immense amount of tension as it relates to years of systemic, I think, oppression and abuse and outright violence in some cases at the hands of law enforcement. And as a result, there has been a clear divide between communities of color, lower income people, and also people who are tired of being challenged with sins of the past. And what I mean by that, I mean Caucasian people who are constantly faced with sins that have happened prior that we have not atoned for, we've not yet admitted or atoned for. Therefore, they and their generations to come will also bear the brunt of dealing with this cancer that has really been a part of our country's foundation. And so you see a lot of people now that are awakening to the reality that we have to go about reimagining how we live together, how we serve together, how we respect one another, and how law enforcement in this country is brought into the 21st century to reflect this new universal commitment to equality and being just across the board. Most of us know that when you look at statistics, you still see the heavy hand of the law and how it has impacted the minority communities, in particular African American and Hispanics, disproportionately incarcerated, disproportionately stopped by law enforcement, and disproportionately shot and often killed by law enforcement. A personal story for me is that in my early 20s, I had the misfortune of being pulled over by a number of police cars at gunpoint, and could have very easily ended up as one of the statistics, like a Stephon Clark or George Floyd, most recent times. The city of Sacramento is a little bit unique in that in a city that is predominantly Caucasian, we have 3 African Americans and a Hispanic on the city council. And yet our police department does not reflect the diversity of our city. is still overwhelmingly Caucasian. I think about 70% at the last count was Caucasian. And I say that to say there is still a huge divide in terms of understanding and learning, appreciating and respecting the different places that we come from, the different places that we live. And so as we begin to reimagine how law enforcement needs to transition into the 21st century, I think Assemblyman McCarty has introduced some bills that I think have great potential. Some of the other legislators have brought forth ideas that I think are very worthy. But one of the principal things I think that insulates law enforcement and make them less accountable to public's concerns is the idea of the limited immunity that has been in place. And in fact, it almost appears to be unlimited immunity instead of some form of limited immunity whereby law enforcement can just feel like they're threatened or say they feel like they're threatened, therefore they need to use deadly force. And I think that's becoming more of an issue, and I'm hopeful that there's going to be some changes as it relates to how police departments and law enforcement across the board are held accountable. And last, let me just say before I, Patricia, yield the mic back, is that I brought forth several items for consideration that to me seem to be common sense and also very practical steps that law enforcement and the city can join hands in accepting. And the three that I've brought forth are really implementable. Two of them are, we can implement them almost immediately. One is to establish a policy that on any stop or encounter with law enforcement would give a business card with their name, their number, and a 1-800 number that people who are either stopped or come in contact with law enforcement, they can report in real time their experience. So we don't have to wait for someone to file a complaint. People, or if we have law enforcement officers that are serving the community and people have positive experiences, we should know that. I think it shines a light a little brighter on the initial interactions between law enforcement and the public. And instead of it being somewhat of an aggressive encounter or the appearance of aggression, everybody knows that this is the new policy. Therefore, we can have a civil discussion about whatever the issue might be. Second, I've asked that we include law enforcement officers by name in each council district they work in. So someone could go online and look up all of the law enforcement that are working in their council districts. And there would be a picture, name, and a short bio on each individual, very similar to council, the mayor, city manager. You can go online, you can get a picture of me, a history of me and the district I represent. I think that would be another positive step. And both of those ideas, I will say, seem to be acceptable to the folks that I've spoke with in law enforcement, the city manager, and I believe they're on their way to being implemented. The third idea is more controversial. It is an automatic suspension without pay for law enforcement officers or police officers in the city of Sacramento if they shoot somebody that is unarmed and unthreatening. So if somebody is running away, you would not shoot them in the back. If there's no weapon, it doesn't have to be a gun or a knife. It could be a bat or some other threatening weapon that could do harm to law enforcement and others, that's different. But we need to stop people who are unarmed from being shot and killed. There are other ways we can deal with even disturbances without having to shoot and take someone's life. And so, you know, we have as a city tried to work even before some of these national protests to implement policies, police review commission, Office of Safety and Accountability, to try to put things in place, but they have not served their purpose. And so I know we're going to get to some other questions on this panel and recommendations for some of the changes that we think, at least that I think, can help us get to where we have a more livable, safe environment for all of us, irrespective of neighborhood, color, race or religion. Sexual orientation should not determine how police officers or law enforcement officers interact with us. And so, again, thank you for having me, and I yield the mic.
The next part of our program will be a panel discussion. So for the first question, what barriers to reforming policing exist at the federal, state, and local levels? Mr. McCarty, would you like to start?
Yeah, I would just say it's entrenched special interests and powerful interests. The police union, extremely powerful. You know, there's a movement led by a number of elected officials, including 4 local brave and dynamic women here in Sacramento, who I think 2 are going to be members of the city council in a few months, serving alongside Mr. Warren, that are focusing on this pledge to not take money from police unions, because it's a conflict of interest. I really don't think it's a conflict of interest. It's really a conflict of one's values, because how can you promote sound public safety and police reform when you're, you know, taking money from the police union that's really against every reform that's been pushed forward? I can tell you, even in this George Floyd era right now, we had a bill this past week that was that didn't make it, and it had strong opposition from law enforcement. It was on the duty to intervene. So think about the George Floyd murder just 2 months ago. There was the officer that, of course, murdered George Floyd in the gutter right there in the sidewalk. And there was a young police officer who sat right next to the officer and did nothing and just watched. And people were trying to intervene. The public was saying, this man's dying, get off of him, he can't breathe. And this officer looked back and saw it and did nothing. So there are a few police departments across the nation. I hope Sacramento, this is an issue for you, Mario, to put on your docket, so it didn't get past us here in the legislature, and you, Alan, is the city should adopt the duty to intervene policy like a few cities have done. But that bill wasn't able to get past the finish line. You know, there have been some efforts to look at the Peace Officer Bill of Rights and whether or not it needs to be updated, talking about the things that Alan Warren mentioned earlier, as far as you know, leave without pay after some of these incidents. I know that people have due process, but it seems like the deck is stacked against reform, and many times it's these powerful interests. But I will say that times are changing. You know, we have today's call with this fabulous group. We have people all across our state, our community, that are saying enough's enough. We've had enough. We want some systematic change and bringing about some justice and racial justice, and a big part of that is police reform. So we're having enough to counter some of these powerful interests from law enforcement, but that's still hard. It's still hard to tell your local sheriff, your local DA, your local police union, no, because you know that they have a big stake in who gets elected, who doesn't get reelected. And so that's going to continue to be, I think, the big issue going forward.
Mr. Guerrero, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think the commission and I recognize that there are barriers to police reform, that not all of these issues can be addressed at the local level. Some certainly need state solutions, and some certainly need federal solutions. At the federal level, qualified immunity, right? That's not something that we can change if there's a federal kind of protection, then the federal government has to respond to that and address qualified immunity. And, I think that we all play a role, but in particular, the elected officials, local or statewide, because they have connections to their federal counterparts, right? Their federal colleagues, congressmen, US senators, that they can say, hey, I'm a local elected here at the city or here with the state, and these are our issues. This is what we believe, and we support these kinds of reforms. So again, qualified immunity is an example of something that a policy that needs to be addressed at the federal level. Certainly at the state level, I mean, I just commend Assemblymember McCarty and Dr. Weber and a number of other elected leaders that are really putting forward changes. I have to acknowledge that, for example, the commission's recommendation to change the standard of use of force going above, beyond AB 392 to, not just when necessary, but sorry, I'm spacing on exactly what I called it, but on as a last resort, that goes further. And to have the city take that kind of policy, kind of lead, would put the city, would benefit the city, but also might hurt the city in some ways. Maybe initially police officers wouldn't want to come here. Maybe we wouldn't want those police officers anyway, right? But nevertheless, having a patchwork of different policies could have an impact at the state level. So it's important to acknowledge that that could happen, right? So yes, I want Sacramento City to lead, but again, some issues are, it's important to address them at the state level. And then there are, of course, the items here locally. We've put recommendations forward that have been, there for 2 years. And the city, of course, has had its hearing where I presented on behalf of the commission. They gave then at a next meeting, they gave SAC-PD an opportunity to respond. And now we've been asked to sit down with SAC-PD and go over those recommendations. Well, we've done that. We do that every time we put forward recommendations. And so it's become quite frustrating that there isn't movement. At the end of the day, we do all this work and it's volunteer. We get a stipend, but I've rejected, and I think most commissioners rejected. We're not here for the stipend. We're here to try to do some good work, right? On behalf of our, in support of our council members and in support of the community. So, we'd like our local elected officials to finally take them up and be upfront and just say, yes, we're going to adopt these recommendations for these reasons. No, we're not going to adopt these recommendations for these other reasons. We're going to adopt these recommendations, but we're going to tweak them for these reasons. I think people would at least understand that. And so it's become frustrating there quite a bit. And then I just wanted to touch on one of the items that Assemblymember McCarty talked about. I believe he talked about, what was it? Duty to intervene. Thank you. So, that's interesting, right? And I keep saying, and I know I know that you know this, and I know that Councilmember Warren knows this, but the details are extremely important. That topic has come up here at the city with SAC-PD, and what we're told, and what I've verified, it is in policy. But there's not much meat to the bones, right? And so if there's no accountability, which is why we have the discipline accountability work group, if it isn't spelled out, if there is a situation and a police officer is in that scenario, which, happened to George Floyd, right? If a police officer has a knee, as an example, has his knee on someone using force inappropriately and another police officer doesn't intervene, I feel like we need to spell out that that is absolutely unacceptable and that police officers should lose their ability to be a police officer at minimum in the city, hopefully within the state, because that shows a total lack of reverence for life. But we don't have that kind of policy in Sacramento. We have mention of a duty to intervene, but we don't have consequences. And so that is where we are at this moment. And I will just end by saying, there are barriers at each level. Certainly there's the political barriers that I didn't touch on that Assemblymember McCarty touched on, which is donations and police unions specifically, which I differentiate between all other unions. But there is something that we can do at every level. And I believe that as citizens, we need to engage at every level, if at all possible, because those barriers exist at each level.
Mr. McCarty, how does your bill, AB 1506, improve oversight of use of force by police?
Well, it would make it more likely that there's a fair investigation in the first place, and potentially it could bring charges against the officer that crossed the line. Let's face it, during the Stephon Clark investigation, our local DA and AG came to the conclusion that the officer followed the law for deadly force. Well, two things. One, we now have a new law in California for deadly force. So going forward, anytime there's one of these incidents where it's questionable, we can evaluate 392, look at the totality of the circumstances and whether or not deadly force was warranted or was there an alternative. So if there is a questionable incident of deadly force, my bill would have a state prosecutor, which is a state attorney general, conduct the investigation. So you wouldn't have the local DA. We have some DAs that support this, some DAs that are opposing it. Some of our local DAs, for example, in Yolo and San Joaquin, to the west and the south, are supporting my bill. Our Sacramento County DA is not supporting it. So, you know, this changes the dynamic, and I think it's going to bring about more public trust in the process. It's not going to guarantee an outcome. It's not going to guarantee that an officer is going to be prosecuted. You know, they could certainly lose their job, and that's part of what Mario is talking about, what the city does, either through this new inspector general, through the current process, through the city manager and the police chief. But our bill is the criminal liability. Should an officer be charged potentially with a crime for crossing the line? It's very rare that you see officers be prosecuted. You look up and down the state, even our region, there's only a handful. I think there's a couple in the region right now going through the process, but it's very, very rare. And so my bill would have the state attorney general, or potentially in the future, a state prosecutor like New York and Connecticut does, be the one who oversees the investigation, comes out with a recommendation, determines whether or not the officer should be charged or not, or should be, you know, basically accounted for through the local process, through their employment, and potentially, you know, if it's warranted, they would be the ones, the state would be the ones who file the charges against the officer.
Mr. Warren, at its meeting on July 1st, the City Council approved Mayor Steinberg's proposal to create an Inspector General position with the power to investigate police shootings and use of force resulting in death or serious injury. Could you please flesh out that proposal and explain how it would work?
Sure. Well, you know, I mean, it's going to start with hopefully hiring the right person, you know, and that's going to be a process in and of itself. But I think the biggest and the most hopeful part of this Inspector General position will be the ability to subpoena information, witnesses, and to make to come up with their findings and then to make those findings public. You know, right now, it is almost never heard of that the investigation from law enforcement officers that have purported to have done a misdeed, if they are found guilty or liable and there's some punishment, the public never knows that officers, you know, things happen and law enforcement officers are reported to have done something wrong, but they're never found guilty. And that is not the case. But I think it's something that McCarty said and Mario as well, they recognize that it's very rare that law enforcement officers are found guilty. And so the Inspector General is supposed to be an unbiased investigation, as well as recommending a type of punishment for a proposed misdeed or crime, and then to make that information public. And so the information would be reported to, our police review commission. The police review commission would then have an opportunity to respond, to come out with their own statement as well. And essentially it would free information flow from a non-law enforcement investigative arm. Typically, it's internal to the police department, or as Assemblyman McCarty said, the district attorney, who is, the appearance is that they are almost always working in concert with law enforcement, and recommendations to have very rarely recommended that they have found law enforcement officers guilty. We also have, as has been stated earlier, this idea that law enforcement is so insular and protective of one another that they don't police themselves. This would give another, again, unbiased, focused on the issues and the facts, investigative force with resources that would then report directly to the council and the mayor's office. So it would not be funneled through the city manager's office as previously, or through the city auditor's office, again, as it's currently. Some of the information is going through those channels. And so, but again, it's really only going to be as effective, I think, as the leaders, because a lot of times the politicians don't have the political will. And I think the buck stops with elected officials, local, state, and federal. And again, you've heard how strong law enforcement's lobbies are. Their unions are very strong. I too am not taking law enforcement money. And it was a very conscious decision, because I think influence can be misinterpreted or legitimized by way of, financially supporting and doing the things, helping to get elected officials elected. And so one of the things I think needs to happen is our elected officials have to be prepared to lose. You have to be prepared to stand on principle and to lead. And you have to be able to look at the power structure and make the necessary changes. I have not seen that political will in Sacramento. I have not seen it at the state. I see bits and pieces of it, but I don't see it across the board. We have things in place that, have allowed law enforcement to basically go unchecked into now the 21st century. And the difference is that media is so immediate. Social media and ways we find out about stuff before, it might take months or years for information to circulate about somebody. It's instantaneous now. We have to be in recognition of where we are as a country. And law enforcement, in my opinion, should welcome these changes. They should welcome people looking underneath the sheets, like an inspector general, like our police review commission, because I think ultimately that makes all of us safer in a healthier community. And so, this is another step. The inspector general it's another layer. It's, I believe it's a political response to the moment. The reality is that our elected officials need to put in the structural changes necessary to bring policing into the 21st century.
Mr. Guerrero, would you like to comment on the commission's role with regard to the Inspector General's findings?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My understanding is that, the Inspector General would conduct the investigation. Once they've finished the investigation, they would, of course, present the information to the public, the mayor and council, and to the commission. The commission could take that information and propose its own recommendation to the mayor and council in regard to that specific investigation. So we could have a different recommendation than the Inspector General. And then, the mayor and council would deliberate. And of course, at the end of the day, it's still the city manager that has the authority to ultimately fire or take some kind of discipline towards a police officer. And so that's the way it would work. And one of the questions we're as a commission that we're taking a look at is that process independent enough? And it's a question that the public should be asking themselves as well, and sharing their perspective with us. Is that independent enough? And again, I'll repeat this at the expense of sounding like a broken record, but the details matter. And so we know that the policies on how that's going to work are not yet written. We know that there are issues in regards to in the investigation process, in that police officers have certain rights under the Police Officers Bill of Rights, and they limit in some ways investigations or the ability to conduct different multiple investigations separately. And so we need to be able to work through that. And here again is an example of something that might need to be addressed at the state level, that if you have three investigations, one by police, one by the county, and one by internal investigations, and maybe one by the Inspector General, and you can only interview the police officer once, how do you do that, right? And so, and there are real, questions to be considered in terms of that officer's rights as well. But that being said, I think that I agree with Councilmember Warren. Police should welcome the transparency and accountability. It's something that it's not just about the community. They're part of the community. It's for them as well as for us to make sure we have a strong police force that people trust.
Thank you. Mr. McCarty, on July 8th, Attorney General Becerra issued his second report on review of the Sacramento Police Department and said that the department should revise its use of force policy to more closely reflect the meaning and intent of Assembly Bill 392. The report said the policy still does not sufficiently incorporate the concept of necessity in its provisions governing the use of deadly force as the legislature intended. Do you agree with the Attorney General's recommendation that the Sacramento Police Department should revise its use of force policy to comply with state law?
Well, first of all, as the author of 392, so Dr. Weber and I were the joint authors of that. I'm really concerned that my city of Sacramento potentially is not following the spirit of the law. I think we have a larger example because we are the seat of government here in Sacramento, the state capital, but also because this issue touched our hearts and our souls so much, and our gut after Stephon Clark. So I have not dug into it. I know the ACLU came up with the same conclusion. I know the city police department has a differing opinion, and the city council and the mayor are weighing into that right now. But I think, the bigger picture, which is actually part of my bill 1506 as well, is we need to prevent these deadly force incidents in the first place. And so I think this is a critical role that the Attorney General, the Department of Justice at the federal level can do, where they can go to some of these police departments and see what are they doing wrong. Like, for example, the city of Sacramento didn't have a rule on its books, like Alan Warren mentioned earlier. When you have a fleeing suspect, you can't shoot him in the back. It's called the fleeing felon rule. And so that's just a common sense one. You shouldn't do that. So that was based upon the first recommendation. So in my bill, the big thing getting all the news is accountability when officers cross the line. But the second part of my bill, it would create a unit within the Attorney General's office to go at cities like Sacramento, like Vallejo, just down the street, which frankly is way worse than we're seeing in our Sacramento area. Unbelievable, abuse of force in that jurisdiction. So the Attorney General was going to go to that city and essentially think of it like an audit. They're going to audit the books, look at their practices, come up with recommendations, like a new set of eyes from the outside. And so I think we should be doing that up and down the state of California, because it's not really about, holding the officers who killed Stephon Clark and George Floyd accountable. That's important, but how do we prevent these in the first place? And so I think that's an important role of government.
The City Council also approved what the Sacramento Bee called a step toward shifting the response for some non-criminal 911 calls, such as those involving people who are homeless or having a mental health crisis, away from the police department and on to non-police professionals. Mr. McCarty, if AB 2054 is enacted, how would its requirement for funding community organizations to participate in emergency responses for vulnerable populations interrelate with the city's efforts?
Yeah, that's a bill authored by my friend and colleague, Assembly Member Sidney Comlager from Los Angeles. And this focuses on the dynamic we're seeing across the nation, which is this, defund the police, which is really complicated and confusing. But I think the easiest way to think about this is think at school districts. Sometimes school districts uses their funds to hire police officers to sit outside and monitor what's going on. And I think, some would say, hey, you'd be better off spending that $150,000, $200,000 you have per officer, maybe hire 2 counselors, a social worker, a mental health professional to focus on that. That's the same approach that we should be looking at police departments across the state. So AB 254 would set up a process to look at that and provide resources to local governments, community groups, nonprofits to come in and help law enforcement make a community safer, because you're not always safe by patrol cars and badges and guns. Sometimes you are, but there are other ways to make a community safe. And that's what we're looking at with that legislation. But I will say that a lot of this is based upon funding, not a lot of new money currently in the budget with the COVID-19 economic crunch that we're facing. But we spend a lot of money on law enforcement anyway. So I think we need to be looking at, and I'm counting on my local people here on the call, and we hear this in these city council elections today loud and clear, is how do you look at the existing budget? Police and fire departments get about 85% of the discretionary budget in the general fund from a city of Sacramento. I was a council member for 10 years. I always remember this number and thought, that's a lot. So what can you do with those existing resources to focus on the priorities that you want to make our community safe as well? So it's the state bill, but also there's a big role in this with local government as well.
We frequently see calls to defund the police, as you just mentioned, and Congresswoman Karen Bass prefers to call them refund the communities. What do you think of these concepts? And this is to all of you. What do you think of these concepts? How do they relate to the city's plans regarding 911 calls? And what is your opinion of these ideas?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. I think this conversation around, or the wording that we're using to, I think, reallocate funds is Kevin said, is misleading and unrealistic. I think generally to defund the police, but there should be a reevaluation of the resources that are being allocated to law enforcement, and then I think a reappropriation. And I think, Assemblyman McCarty was right. There are ways in which we use law enforcement that they're not the best suited parties to deal with these issues. And part of the city's analysis right now, and I think we're moving in a direction where we are going to reallocate funding from police to social service workers and counselors and mental health professionals, because they are trained and oftentimes have certifications, licenses, and the various requisites to handle the situations, whereby the police department, they get 40 hours of training as it relates to trying to understand mental illness. That's equivalent to what five 8-hour days. So that's equivalent to a week of training. And then we charge them with criminals, and we've seen the disastrous results in the Mann case in Sacramento and others, where law enforcement have really missed. I don't want to say misdiagnosed, because it wasn't a full diagnosis, but they've misunderstood what was going on with people who were mentally challenged, and ultimately. And the other thing that most people don't realize too is that these costs, both emotionally and physically, and the loss of lives, are very traumatizing to cities. But not only are they traumatizing to cities, they cost all of you and me money, all the taxpayers. We give out, pay out millions, tens, and sometimes even more, millions of dollars when people get shot and killed. Whether there's a conviction or not, whether there's a finding or not, that the police officers did something wrong. So we are being taxed. Our tax money overwhelmingly goes to law enforcement by way of the general fund. And then we also, in addition to what they get from the general fund, are causing millions and millions of dollars of other expenses that need to be paid. We are supposed to be charged with, like parks and streets and water quality and some of the other things, flood control, when we have to collaborate with the county and the state. And so, it's a huge cost when these missteps. And again, it would seem that law enforcement would understand, and they are to protect and serve. And I think it's not just our lives, but it's our city in totality. It's our resources, it's our time, it's our emotions. And I would like to see us elevate the expectation of law enforcement. And so I am very hopeful. However, it's going to be an uphill battle, as it continues to be when you're trying to make changes to the institution of law enforcement.
Any other comments?
I want to just add on what Alan just talked about, and I'm going to do a bill next year. We ran out of time this year on the transparency of these settlements. They're not always judgments from the court. Frankly, they're settlements from the city council. And I remember being in closed session as a council member for 10 years, and they're always about lawsuits. Sometimes there were the truck driver, trash driver who took a turn too tight and hit a car and so forth. But there were mainly these law enforcement settlements, and especially the county level, because think about the counties oversee these county jails, and there's always activity there, and a lot of, frankly, our B has written over and over about this, of some inappropriate activity from sheriff deputies, and there's so much money that the public doesn't know. If they knew that last year the Sacramento County and City doled out north of $25 million, those monies could go to fund these crisis programs we talk about, intervention. They could go to our parks, our youth programs, keeping kids out of trouble. The city of Los Angeles, this is crazy, they have to borrow money from Wall Street. They're called police brutality bonds. They have to borrow money from investors in Wall Street to pay out their settlements and pay these for a number of years. So there's a tremendous amount of money that were being spent. So it's not just our morals and our values as far as who should be, harmed in our communities, and we know disproportionately it's communities of color. But for taxpayers, this is a big accountability issue as well. And so this is an issue that you're going to see a larger focus on, and I'm glad that Mr. Warren brought it up just now as well.
Pat, the only thing I'll add, and it's not specific to this question, it's specific to the question you asked Assemblymember McCarty earlier about whether the city is complying with AB 392. And I will say that, you know, the commission has also been of the position that we have not been. And when I presented the commission's recommendations, I believe it was in July, I presented a spreadsheet that included at least 2 incidents of language in AB 392, very important, critical language in AB 392 not being included and therefore excluded under the city's General Order 580.02, which is the use of force law, and so ordinance. And so clearly I will repeat that I can't put it any clearer. The city at some point said we were complying when they clearly were not. And it's not the, I mean, it's SAC PD, right? They've said they're complying. There's at least 2 instances that are black and white. They were not, because they did not include these critical components in AB 392. The other thing I will say is that there is what AB 392 is, and then there's the spirit. And the spirit is, for example, ensuring that any policy includes very robust examples of de-escalation, because that is, those are the tactics by which police officers can use to not, you know, instead of use of force or use of lethal force. And so I just wanted to touch on that point. I believe that they are going to maybe change those 2 incidences, which would make them comply with the, you know, letter of the law, but then there's the spirit of the law that will still be missing, which are in some of our recommendations. So I just wanted to add that context, and again, thank Assemblymember McCarty for, you know, really moving that amazing bill forward, and thank Mr. Warren also for his recommendations. I'm possibly going to integrate that into this. Earlier when you introduced yourself, you mentioned a couple of recommendations that I thought were pretty great. So I'm going to see if we can integrate them into the discipline accountability work group. So I'll be reaching out to your office.
And on a related topic, ABC 10 released a report 10 days ago on August 13th, which found that the same 7 officers were involved in more than 20% of the violent shootings in Sacramento County. 9 of the 11 shootings were fatal, and 5 involved unarmed suspects. All of them were deemed lawful by both internal investigations and the district attorney, and all officers are still employed by the same law enforcement agency. I assume that causes you some concern, but how can this issue be addressed?
Well, I think we're looking at it.
You know, this.
Go ahead, Alan.
After you, sir.
We're all in this together. So it's at the state level, the local level. So I think we need to bring about more accountability. So I think with this new law, the state level, we can focus on accountability and potential prosecution. Frankly, most aren't going to reach that level. So we need to focus on what the city's doing with this either inspector general, and I do hope it's more independent and less tinkering from the city manager and the police chief, so they can bring about transparency and focus on who these officers are. And also, too, think about it. If you are a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, even someone that cuts hair and does nails, you have to get a professional license. And if you mess up, you lose that license. That's your livelihood, a real estate license, what have you, right? If you're a police officer, many times you can bounce around from one department to the other. And let's say the inspector general or whatever is happening in the city, they know they're gonna, the hammer's gonna come down on them. They quit, they resign, they go work in a little police department up in Yuba City or, someplace in the Central Valley. And so that's their problem. So we need to make sure we hold officers accountable. So we call this decertification. That's another big bill going through the process. So there are a lot of pieces of the puzzle, but we need to step up our our law enforcement and get people in there who want to protect and serve and don't cross the line. And, you know, look, most officers are not the officer that killed George Floyd. So we need to value the ones that do a good job and frankly, bring about accountability and weed out the ones that aren't. And so it's going to take, it's not one bill, it's not one ordinance, it's not one city commission. It's going to take a continued focus on this front.
Yeah, and I'll add that, you know, there's complicity in law enforcement officers not feeling the obligation to report bad behavior. And somehow that needs to work itself into law enforcement instead of, you know, you hear about on the streets, in jails and places, you hear about snitches, and snitches have a bad connotation and that. But law enforcement, you know, is not street behavior. It's a structured, you know, principled way to deal with the kinds of behavior we're trying to weed out in society. And so they should be held, in my opinion, to the highest of standards. And there should be something that should require law enforcement officers to speak up. You know, and not in a, it doesn't have to start off as a punitive. You know, it could be learning. Some people come from different places, they have different biases, which is another reason why we need to increase diversity in law enforcement. I think that would help with some of the issues. But we have to get police officers to understand that their responsibility is not just policing the public, it's also policing themselves. And I know we're not there yet. And then the other thing that I neglected to have violent incidences with policing, whether it be shootings or, you know, billy clubs, hitting people, or doing some type of violent behavior. You know, I think it would be logical to have testing, substance abuse testing, alcohol, drugs, pull somebody over, they're exhibiting unstable behavior, you know, you test them for drunk driving or alcohol. And I think law enforcement should be held to that same standard. And not only that, furthermore, they should also be tested, I believe, for steroids, which also, I think, embolden people to do things they would not ordinarily do. And it seems reasonable and rational that, you know, 99.9% of law enforcement officers are not going to be doing drugs and drinking and all of that. And they should accept something like that willingly. You know, that's this whole other idea that we can be transparent and we have the best people policing us. If some of these things that would make policing and transparency and helping build bridges between communities and inclusion and diversity, if these things are not embraced, it's very difficult to trust. And they have not been embraced, irrespective of what they say. Majority of police departments are primarily Caucasian, very few African Americans, you know, few Hispanics. And so we know that diversity has not been accepted in law enforcement. And we have these years of statistics to prove it out. So things like diversity and inclusion and testing, I think those things are very important to help get us to a place where we understand what policing should represent, and the taxpayers who pay police officers should have a substantial say in that. And I think that's what they're saying right now. Some of these very things need to change.
Pat, I would just add, I agree with Councilmember Warren. I would just add that we certainly need tools to be able to, not hire police officers who are transferring, for example, with too much, when we know that in their background they have too many use of force incidents, like gross negligence. And the thing is that I don't know how, it's something we need to look at, how available that information is to the city when they're looking at hiring. But the other thing is looking at the idea that if you have a current police officer, and as you just noted, based on data, not on any other issue, but based on data, you have a number of police officers that have been responsible for a good number of the shootings. That has to drop a red flag for most reasonable individuals. And so at minimum, there needs to be a retraining for those individuals. But at what point, we need to delineate at what point are those individuals not officers that we don't want serving in Sacramento, right? And we need to do the hard work of delineating that. I don't know what that is today, but I believe we should look at that. So that's what I would simply add.
Thank you. My final question concerns how the public can engage and support reforms in policing. Specifically, what suggestions do you have for our audience on how they can make a difference on these important public safety issues?
Well, I would just say what you're doing right now, having this dialogue. Can you see me right there? Let me see if I can go back. Yeah, okay. Having this dialogue right now and talking about these issues, engaging the larger community, because let's face it, we're not going to bring about systemic change and these big push for racial justice and police reform with the traditional ACLU, NAACP type, just pushing it. That we've been trying and we've had limited success, but we need a larger audience. We need groups like today. We need you all to write letters and to have a support letter on these bills and get the bill numbers. I know you have a bunch of engaged people on the call right now. Some have been texting me. They can tell you how to do that and show up at city council meetings, help Alan, help Mario, because we need more voices. We need unconventional voices. I'll just tell you that I had my big bill was up this week in the legislature in the Appropriations Committee, and I had AT&T, the multi, billion-dollar telecommunications company, and they said, "Hey, our CEO heard about this bill, wants to support it." And I said, "That's amazing," because those voices, when you hear, really help. And so, I think there's a big opportunity for the greater Sacramento community, including you all, to get involved in police reform. So thank you. Thank you for having us today as well.
I would just add, there's a lot of value in public protest. And I know that there have been a lot of these public protests happening. And, I teach political science courses at Sacramento State. And, there is a difference between, of course, peaceful protests and protests that turn to violence and looting, et cetera. But I think the majority of these protests have been peaceful, and they're an outlet for a voice, and they're an important part of the way to make change. One of the things I teach in my class is we look at charts over time of the civil rights movement and other movements, and you realize that at the time when we actually made progress as a country to really more fully live up to our values was when those protests were at their peak. And so protesting is an absolutely important part of this, and it's why there's so much attention to some needed reforms. So I'm hopeful that in addition to, of course, writing letters, attending city council meetings, calling your council members, your assembly members, your Congress members, and engaging in that people continue with protests until they see some of the change that they'd like. Because I can tell you from my vantage point, some of the will to make some of these needed important changes seems to be waning, and that would be unfortunate.
Yeah,
Mr.
I
Warren,
would
do
just
you
say
have-
that, yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. This issue has not been impacted over the years in traditional means, and I think that these issues have to be elevated, prioritized, and then laser focused. And I agree that forums, and panel discussions like this are important, but setting priorities for a city or for groups of people, and then working together with other community groups, other groups that are not zero sum in their approach, like some groups are when they approach us as the council. They want us to either do something or then they want to be against you. I think this is an approach that we should all be able to get to a win. And we've not done that. And I wonder, I think about why we haven't done it. And again, I go back to systemic racism and then the other phobias that come out of it. And so maybe in dealing with racism, we impact policing. Maybe when we deal with racism, we impact social justice. Maybe when we deal with racism, we deal with economic disparities. Maybe we deal with education. The things that weight our community down, I think, are rooted in some of the same things. This police issue, if those of you who have not done it, if you Google how policing started in America, a lot of it was rooted after the Civil War, when white farmers, plantation owners, were trying to force newly emancipated people back to the farms to work, because those farms could not produce and do the things they were doing when they had slaves. And so Ku Klux Klan, outgrowths of that whole struggle. And what I'm saying is what I've read. And so what I would suggest is we go back and just Google or go to look at policing in America, the foundation of policing in America. And you see what racism has been a cancer in our society since its founding. It helped to make free slave labor, helped to make America and grow America at a faster pace than all of the other countries that had started way before America. And so, this is about policing and reforms, but I think it is rooted in some of the same things that are now, they were once strengths of this country because it helped to propel the country, but now they become burdens. And I think the burden will continue to be heavy and heavy, and ultimately could be not the demise, but it is definitely going to take the shine, and it has taken the shine off of America. We see how divided things are now, but I think it is a wonderful opportunity to discuss it. And I think when people talk about these very difficult issues, we have a chance to find common ground, and ultimately healing can take place. And so I'm thankful for the opportunity to share. This panel probably could have gone another hour or two with a lot more of my thoughts and others' thoughts. And Mario and Kevin have a lot of insight on things. And so it's been an honor to be here, and I thank you for extending the invitation to me.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers for your interesting and informative presentations. Thank you to all of the participants Please join us for our next webinar on September 22nd, which will be in support of 3 justice initiatives on the November ballot, Propositions 15, 16, and 17. Thanks again.